Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today is part 1 of our updated European Coffee Roaster tier list. In celebration of hitting the 3,000 subscriber milestone, we'll be updating our European Coffee Roaster tier list. So let's go through the criteria for the coffee roasters that we did select to make it on this list. And each of these coffee roasters must meet one of 3 requirements. The first being that we've had at least 2 full bag reviews of their coffee on this channel. The second being that they've been featured in at least 2 Cafe Box Advent Calendar series, and that can either be our individual reviews or our blind taste test ranking series, meaning that we've tried out at least 4 samples of their coffee. And then last, our coffee roasters that were featured in our previous European Coffee Roaster tier list, and we just wanted to update their placement on this tier list. All right, let's go through the tiers that are featured in this list, and we have 6 of them. At the very top, we have the World Class category, and that is usually reserved for my top 5 favorite coffee roasters in the entire world. And as a quick disclaimer and heads up, none of the coffee roasters that are featured in this list will make it into that World Class category, though there are definitely some coffee roasters that have potential to get there. And that does take us into our second tier, which is the Amazing category. And that's usually reserved for coffee roasters that are just outside of that top 5 and ones that I feel like could one day make it in there, as they definitely have the potential to, and we've had some really enjoyable coffees from them. After that, we have the Great category, and that Great category is reserved for coffee roasters that I usually check in on quite regularly. They've had coffees that I very much enjoyed from them in the past, and usually have some innovative and interesting coffees throughout the year as well. So ones that I definitely keep close track of, and ones that I've enjoyed a lot more than other coffee roasters. After that, we've had the Good category, and the Good category is usually reserved for coffee roasters that I've maybe had some mixed experiences with. Maybe I've had some really good coffees from them, maybe I've had some just okay coffees, or maybe in general I've had some pretty average coffees, but in general they do turn out to be better than the average coffee roaster out there. After that, we have the OK category, and usually coffee roasters that fall in the OK category are coffee roasters that I may have had more misses than hits with, and coffee roasters that usually don't necessarily align with my own preferences too often. And then last, we have the Not My Cup category, and that is usually reserved for coffee roasters that are definitely away from my own preferences. So coffee roasters that may go a little bit more developed, may offer a little bit more experimental or heavier processed coffees. And we do have a couple of those on here as well. But as a quick disclaimer, none of the coffee roasters featured in this list are bad by any means. This is a very subjective list. So these are some of the best coffee roasters out there in general. Now let's go ahead and get started with this list, beginning with A Matter of Concrete, which is based out of Rotterdam, Netherlands. And they're one of the coffee roasters on this list that I have the least amount of experience with, as we've only reviewed 2 of their coffees, and interestingly enough, both of those were wash processed Colombian coffees. And I didn't necessarily have the best experience with either of those coffees, as this coffee roaster is a little bit more developed than I would have liked, which is a little unfortunate given that they have so many interesting offerings on their website, as I've definitely found some coffees that I wanted to purchase from them. The biggest issue has been the shipping costs to the United States, which has hindered me from purchasing maybe more of their coffees. But the few experiences that I did have weren't necessarily the best, and the one I'm thinking of most predominantly is the Julian Calderón, which is a coffee that I had some very high expectations for, but was definitely notably more developed than I was expecting going into it. So they do have potential to go higher than our placement this time around, but based off of the 2 experiences that we do have, I will put them in the OK category for right now. Next up, we have April, which is based out of Copenhagen, Denmark. And they were one of the coffee roasters that were featured in our previous European Coffee Roaster tier list, and we put them in the Good category. And the main reason we put them in that category was because the 3 coffees we had reviewed from them were all just fine. I didn't find anything exceptional from them, but I wasn't disappointed by any of them either. Since then, we've done 2 full bag reviews of their coffee on this channel, one of which being a bio-innovative coffee, which it's not surprising I didn't like that coffee. I didn't expect to like that coffee whatsoever. But outside of that, we actually had a Hacienda La Esmeralda Catuai, a washed Panamanian coffee that I very much enjoyed. It was very impressive for a non-Panamanian geisha, a washed non-Panamanian geisha that we'd reviewed on this channel. And we do have one more review of them coming up as well. And I think that'll kind of explain why I decided to change the placement on this tier list, because not only was that Hacienda La Esmeralda better than I was expecting, but the coffee that we are reviewing from them was also better than I was expecting. So I'm very happy to bump them up 1 category and put them in the great range, as I do feel like they definitely have potential to be one of the better coffee roasters out there, and I've enjoyed a couple of the coffees that we've had from them recently. All right, that takes us to Banny Beans, which is based out of Ljubljana, Slovenia. And they're a coffee roaster we did an entire series on, as we've reviewed a total of, I want to say 6 or 7 of their coffees. We have a washed Kenya, Colombia, Ethiopia, a natural Ethiopia, and a honey processed Colombian coffee. Yes, I do have some notes for all of these coffee roasters because there are a lot of coffees we've reviewed on this channel. But the series that we did was kind of interesting because my favorite coffee of the ones that we did review was that honey processed Colombian coffee, which I wasn't necessarily expecting to be my favorite. But outside of that, I wasn't overly impressed with any of the other coffees that we did have. And the most recent experience we had was after we had placed an order from Airworks, which was one of their wash processed coffees. And I felt like that was going to gauge where I wanted to place them on this tier list because I was a little undecided between good and okay. I didn't necessarily find their coffees to be anything that really stood out to me, at least as far as the ones we had. Honey processed Colombia is maybe the one coffee that I could justify being in that great category. Even then, it would be on the lower range of that. And then I would say that the majority of the coffees probably fall into that good category. So there's somewhere between the good and okay, but I'm feeling really generous today, so they benefit from that. I'll put them in the good category for right now. A little bit more developed than I would necessarily like, but this is primarily based off of the positive experiences I had with that honey processed Colombian coffee. All right, next up we have Bell Lane, which is based out of Mullingar, Ireland. And this coffee roaster is one of the only coffee roasters on this list that made it to our top 10 coffees of the year list. And I think it's the only one on this list currently that actually made it in the top 10 this year itself, as I had an extremely positive experience with the Johann Vergara, a wash processed Colombian coffee, a pink bourbon one at that. And it was a little disappointing that people that ordered it from Airworks didn't have the same positive experience that I had, as it sounds like the coffee wasn't quite as good as the first impression that I did have from it, because it was extremely peach forward, enough to the point where it was reminiscent of a wash processed Ethiopian coffee. And truth be told, based off of that result, I was originally planning on putting them in the amazing category if any of the other coffees we had from them was equally as good as that Johann Vergara. Since then, we've had 2 full reviews of their coffee, one of which was a Peruvian Gesha, and then the other was, I want to say, an anaerobic wash processed Colombian coffee. And I think that they were both fine. They weren't anything near as good as the Johann Vergara that we had as well. So while they definitely did have potential to make it into that amazing category, because I really like the way that they roast their coffees, they're similar to Calendar for me in a number of ways, and they're a bit more intense in them as well. They seem to also be roasting on a roasting machine that I really like. I believe it is on the Gießen. So there's so many positives about this coffee roaster. And I feel like if maybe I'd had a little bit of a better experience, maybe if they were a bit more reminiscent of a sample pack that I had, then we're probably putting them in that amazing category. They definitely have potential to make it there as well, but for right now, I'm going to put them in the great category. That Johann Vergara is carrying it because it was just such an impressive coffee. All right, next up we have Blossom Coffee Roasters, which is based out of Manchester, England. And this is another coffee roaster that I have very limited experience with. Only reviewed 2 full bags of their coffee, and I was very fortunate to even get my hands on those coffees, as there was a multi-roaster in Philadelphia that was carrying them, and I was able to get somebody to send them to me after paying them for these coffees. And they were a lot of what I was expecting, given that this is an English-based coffee roaster, as I'm not the biggest fan of English-based coffee in general. They do tend to be a bit more developed than I necessarily would have liked. Now, I do want to give Blossom their credit, because their coffees did turn out, I would say, a little bit better than I was expecting, but at the same time, they were definitely still coffees that I wouldn't necessarily go out of my way again to get. It's just that English profile that doesn't necessarily seem to align with my own preferences, and that's going to be a little bit of the theme when it comes to English coffee roasters. I'll put them, there's somewhere between these two, but given that I just tend to not like the English style of roasting, I'm going to put it in the not my cup for right now. Next up, we have Bonanza Coffee Roasters, which is based out of Berlin, Germany. And we did 2 full bag reviews of their coffee, and it was a very, we'll say, safe choice. We picked a natural processed Ethiopian coffee and a wash processed Colombian coffee, and they're a coffee roaster that's been around for quite a while. You can see they even have it listed on their logo itself, and one that I feel like has had a lot of praise and acclaim over the years. That being said, the profile of this coffee also wasn't in line with my own preferences. It was a fair bit more developed than I was necessarily expecting. And given that there are some German coffee roasters that I've had really positive experiences with, I was really hoping that Bonanza would also be on par with those. However, that wasn't necessarily the case, as I found myself not being the biggest fan of either of the two coffees that we had reviewed from them. And I think all of that's to say that their profile, once again, isn't in line with my own preferences. So they also fall somewhere between these two, but I'm going to also put them in the not my cup category. Though I do have to say, I think they have a coffee shop out in Korea, and I really want to go visit that coffee shop in Korea because I'd love to go back to Korea and review a number of coffee shops out there. All right. Next up, we have Dock Coffee Roasters, which is based out of Amsterdam, Netherlands. And this is a coffee roaster that was also featured in our previous European coffee roaster tier list. And we put them in just the okay category. And it is kind of funny because there's a coffee roaster on this list I have probably the most familiarity with, maybe outside of Manhattan. But I do have to say that I would consider myself much more familiar with Dock than Manhattan these days. Ever since Manhattan has switched their roasting machine, their coffees are completely different than what they once were. Dock, on the other hand, has been an interesting journey ever since the first time I did try them. I want to say that they've been around since 2019 or so, but we've had everything and anything that you could imagine from them. They're wildly processed coffees, they're wash processed coffees, at times when they were a little bit more developed, at times where they were super light. So I've seen everything that Dock has to offer. But since our last placement of them, we've had more of their wash processed coffees, which is my own preference. And I feel like at times their wash processed coffees can be quite nice. People love Milky Cake. We put our Milky Cake review on this channel as well. So that seemed to give them some additional help. And even though our coffee of the month as of the time of recording is Coco Bongo, which could, push them right back down to the category we had them placed in originally, I still think in general, I've enjoyed their coffees a lot more since the last time we put them on this tier list. So I'm going to bump them up to good. I think that they're doing a better job. So credit to Dock. I think that they could even go up from there, given just how many interesting coffees they usually have. All right. Next up, we have another coffee roaster that was featured in our previous European coffee roaster tier list, and that's Father's, based out of Ostrava, Czech Republic. And interestingly enough, we've reviewed so many of their coffees on this channel. I want to take a look. I think we have something like 9 coffee reviews. And it's been a hodgepodge of random things, naturals, honey processed, and washed coffees, and Ugandan coffees. It's just been a random mix of a random number of coffees from them. And that's because there is a multi-roaster nearby that does carry their coffee pretty regularly. And they are a Czech-based coffee roaster, so one that I usually like to visit as often as I can. Now, the big thing that has changed since the last time we put them on this tier list is that they have switched roasting machines. I want to say it was a Diedrich that they were using before. I could have that wrong. But since then, they have switched to a Loring. And I know a lot of people make the assumption that I don't like Loring coffees, even though we rate a lot of Loring coffee roasters really high. I think I just have a preference usually for drum roasters. And when a coffee roaster goes from a drum roaster to a Loring and you notice a big difference between them, it's not necessarily for the benefit of my own preferences, but Father's is one of the ones that I was surprised by because I think they did a very good job with the transition. I wanted to give them massive credit for that because the Kenyan coffee we had had from them since the transition was still nice. But what was the big sticking point was the Karamo, which is a coffee that I enjoyed so much from them years past that it ended up in our top 10 coffees of the year list. But the most recent iteration that we'd had from them since they switched to Loring wasn't anywhere near as good. And as a result, I do have to bump them down because the main reason they made it into that amazing category was because of just how much I enjoyed that Karamo. But since then, it hasn't been quite as good, even though I still think they did a very good job since that transition. We'll put them in the great category still. All right. Next up, we have Fuglen, which is based out of Oslo, Norway. And they're a coffee roaster that has been featured in 2 of our Cafe Box Advent Calendar series. So we've had them in a couple of our blind taste test ranking series. And I visited one of their coffee shops out in Tokyo. So we do have a review from one of their Tokyo-based coffee shops as well. And given that they're a Nordic-based coffee roaster, I fully expected them to be a lot lighter than they turned out to be, but their coffee does have a fair bit more development to them, and it wasn't quite as noticeable in the Cafe Box Advent Calendar series, but when I actually went out to their coffee shop and tried it in Tokyo, it wasn't quite to the level or extent that I was expecting. So they mostly finished in the middle range of those blind taste test ranking series, and I would say that their coffees for the most part have been fine with me. I think that for that reason, I have to put them in the okay category. I will probably be revisiting them in the future. What's also interesting about them is I scrapped a review of one of their coffees because I tried it and I just didn't necessarily like it. So I didn't even feel like it was worth putting the review up. So not necessarily my favorite coffee roaster out there, but I did enjoy visiting their coffee shops in Tokyo. That was kind of nice. All right, next up we have Good Life Coffee, which is based out of Helsinki, Finland. And they're a coffee roaster that we did 2 reviews of, if I have it correct, and it was a washed Burundi and a natural processed Ethiopian coffee. And they were suggested to us, and it looks like they've received a lot of praise for their roasting style. And since our reviews, they have switched roasting machines, I heard. So I think that the 2 reviews are kind of, I don't want to say useless at this point, but they're not representative of what the coffee roaster is now. They've changed their roasting machine, so I imagine that the coffee is a little different. That being said, I wasn't the biggest fan of either of the 2 coffees that we did have from them. Once again, largely due to the fact that I expected them to maybe be a little lighter than they were. So the only other Finnish-based coffee roaster we have a lot of familiarity with is Frukt. And that's a coffee roaster that I really enjoy. So I was hoping that they would be on a similar level to Frukt. But again, a little bit more developed than I would have necessarily liked. So I'm going to say not my cup for right now. I think that based off of the experiences that we did have, it's a pretty safe guess that their profile is a little further than I would necessarily like, but we will hopefully revisit them some point in the future, given that their coffee should be different than what we experienced from them with the 2 reviews we do have. All right, we have, looks like 3 more coffee roasters that will be on this list. The rest we're going to be saving for part 2, but next up we have Kaffe, which is based out of Oslo, Norway. And this is a very interesting coffee roaster. It's another one that we're changing the placement on this list, as last time around they were in the amazing category. And that was largely due to the Buku Sais, a natural processed Ethiopian coffee that I enjoyed so much. It ended up on our top 10 coffees of the year list the year it was featured. Outside of that, the coffees that were featured in that Cafe Box Advent Calendar were very nice, and then we went and reviewed 2 of their coffees as a result. I had such positive experiences with their coffees that we made it a point to purchase and review a couple of their coffees, one of which I want to say was a Kenya, and then the other was a Peru, and both were very, very nice. And this is when they were still roasting on the Probat. But this is another example of a coffee roaster switching from a drum roaster that I very much enjoyed to a Loring. And it sounds like they've also gone a little different in the direction of their profiles, as once upon a time they were a little lighter. And at this moment, they're not quite to that same extent. But what's been the biggest sticking point for me is I probably would have left them in the category that they were, but they were featured in our most recent Cafe Box Advent Calendar series, and we tried 2 of their coffees, and truth be told, they were 2 of my least favorite coffees from the entirety of the Advent Calendar, but it's largely because they selected 2 much more processed coffees out there, and that's going to make things very difficult because I definitely didn't like either of those 2 coffees. Neither of them were in line with my own preferences. I think when they had very lightly roasted Probat-based washed coffees, those were very much on par with my own preferences, and that's why I was very happy to put them in that amazing category. But I'm not going to ding them as hard as I could based off of those 2 coffees. I'm just going to bump them down to the good category because I feel like I had such positive experiences with them from the start. And just because the 2 coffees I had weren't in line with my own preferences, it would be harsh to push them down even further than that. All right. Next, we have Leuchtfeuer, which is based out of Fiedel, Germany. And I'm curious how many coffees we've actually reviewed from them. It looks like 8 or so. But I think it's 7 as of the time of recording. I think our Christmas coffee review is coming out here before this tier list is going to be out, though, so that'll make it 8. But I would say I've had a bit of a mixed bag experience with them as a whole. So they do have some very nice higher end offerings. They've had Pepe's coffees. They've had some really nice Panamanian geishas. And then the coffee that stood out the most for me, and the one I want to highlight, is the Larita SL34, the Best of Panama version, the year that it did come out, which I want to say was 2023, if I have my time frame correct. And that was a very impressive coffee. And I think it ended up in our top 5 of our top 10 coffees of that year list. So that's a huge testament to just how much potential they do have as a coffee roaster. But that being said, we've also had some not so good experiences. That Christmas coffee is probably the most developed coffee that we've reviewed on this channel in a very, very long time. And they did list it as a medium roast, so I should have expected that going into it. But even then, I was just surprised at how developed that coffee was. And there are some coffees we had from them that I had much higher expectations for and didn't quite live up to those expectations. So it's kind of difficult on where I want to place them. And more recently, some of the coffee samples we've had from them haven't been quite as good as what I remember. So at their best, they're definitely in that amazing category. That Lorita back in the year it was released was truly exceptional. In addition to that, some of the other Panamanian Geshas we had from them were exceptional. But we've also had some coffees that I would say definitely just weren't my thing, most specifically that Christmas coffee. Last moment sort of thing. They're probably somewhere between the good and great, but I mentioned that I'm feeling in a generous mood, so we'll put them in the great category for right now. It would be kind of interesting if I were to rank these 4 on where I would place all 4 of them. All right. And our final coffee for this part 1, and that is Mame, I want to say is the way you pronounce it, and they're based out of Zurich, Switzerland. And we've only reviewed 2 of their coffees, a wash processed Kenya and a natural processed Ethiopian coffee. And I would say that both of those were better than I was expecting. Like, they both turned out pretty nice. And it's a bit unfortunate that they've had a number of other coffees that I really wanted to purchase, but again, shipping costs, and that was the main reason why we didn't. They've just in general had a lot of interesting coffees over the years. But the biggest determining factor on where I want to place them on this tier list is something that didn't actually have anything to do with any of our reviews. It's when I went out to their booth at SCA Japan in Tokyo back in, I want to say 2023, they had a setup where you could go in there and purchase any of their coffees. They were going to brew any of their coffees for you. And Kai Jansen was their special guest as they were brewing some of Jansen's coffees as well. And at SCA, it was the longest line out of any of the booths because so many people really wanted to try their coffees. And I remember how excited I was. It ended up being the only coffee I paid for in that entire event. Like, all the coffee was free with the exception of the Mame booth that was set up. And I purchased that Jansen, and given that I had had positive experiences with that coffee roaster, given how much hype there was, and given how many people had been standing in line for a very long time to purchase it, I was a little disappointed by the way that the coffee did turn out, given the experiences I had had with them outside of that coffee. I think it was somewhere around $25 for a pretty small sample size of that coffee, but that probably swayed where I wanted to place them, because originally I probably would have placed them in good, but given that that was such a beautiful coffee, it was a washed Panamanian Jansen that I had very high expectations for, and it wasn't near as good as I was hoping. I think for right now I'll place them in the good category. As I already mentioned, they have so many coffees that are interesting to me that it's just a matter of time before we do go back and review more of their coffees, so that could definitely change from this point going forward. All right. That is the first part of our European coffee roaster tier list. So as you guys can see, we have probably the most interesting coffee roasters coming up in the second part. So stay tuned for that, but we're going to leave this first part at this. So if you guys are enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been part 1 of our updated European coffee roaster tier list. Thank you for watching.